This video is created for informational purposes only. Everyone mentioned is treated with respect, and no harm or disrespect is intended. Viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of July 19, 2004, Mark Hacking called 911 at 10:49 a.m. from a Salt Lake City parking lot. His wife, Lori, had gone jogging at Memory Grove Park hours earlier and never came home. Within hours, over 1,000 volunteers flooded the park, searching through trails and canyons. They were looking for a missing pregnant woman. But what they didn't know was that the man crying on television, the husband pleading for his wife's safe return, had already killed her. He'd shot her in the head while she slept, rolled her body in carpet and thrown her into a dumpster. For 3 months, investigators would search a massive landfill, sifting through tons of garbage to find what Mark Hacking had tried to bury forever. This is the true story of how one lie destroyed everything. Tonight, you'll see the exact moment Lori discovered her husband's secret life. You'll learn how investigators tracked her body through an entire landfill using carpet fibers and cadaver dogs. And you'll hear Mark's own words when he confessed to his brothers in a psychiatric hospital. Every fact in this story comes from verified court documents, police reports, and news archives. This case shows how years of deception can end in murder when the truth finally comes out. This is how a man built an entire false identity, and when it collapsed, he killed the one person who knew the truth. Lori Kay Soares was born on December 31, 1976, in Los Angeles, California. She was adopted by Thelma Soares, a single mother, and grew up with strong family values. By 2004, at 27 years old, Lori worked as a stockbroker's assistant for Wells Fargo Securities Services in Salt Lake City. Her colleagues knew her as someone who remembered everyone's birthdays, who made work feel less isolating, who genuinely cared about people. Mark Douglas Hacking was born into what many would consider an ideal family. His father, Douglas Hacking, was a respected physician in Salt Lake City. Mark grew up with expectations, the kind that come from being part of a prominent family in a tight-knit community. But by his late 20s, Mark hadn't followed the path everyone assumed he would. Lori and Mark married in August 1999. For 5 years, they appeared to be building the kind of life people admire from the outside. They attended church together, hiked in the Wasatch Mountains, and talked about their future with the kind of certainty that comes from shared dreams. By the summer of 2004, Lori was 5 weeks pregnant. They'd already told both families. Mark's mother later said Lori glowed when she talked about becoming a mother, but there was something else happening in the summer of 2004, something that would define the final days of Lori's life. Mark had been telling everyone he was about to graduate from the University of Utah and had been accepted to medical school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The couple had already started preparing for the move. Lori was quitting her job at Wells Fargo. They'd attended a going-away party thrown by her co-workers. There was even a photo of Lori standing behind a cake that read, "We'll miss you, Lori." She was smiling, surrounded by friends, ready to start the next chapter of her life. The problem was that none of it was real. Mark Hacking had never graduated from the University of Utah. He'd stopped attending classes years earlier and was still several credits short of earning his undergraduate degree. He'd never applied to medical school at UNC Chapel Hill. There was no acceptance letter. There was no future in North Carolina. The entire life Mark had been selling to Lori, to his family, to everyone who knew him, was a fabrication he'd been maintaining through years of calculated deception. Mark worked as a psychiatric hospital orderly, but even there, he couldn't be himself. Patients later told investigators that Mark insisted they call him Franz, even though they knew his real name. It was another small lie in a life built on them, another false identity layered on top of all the others. By mid-July 2004, the lies were about to catch up to him, and when they did, Mark made a choice that would end one life and destroy countless others. Friday, July 16, 2004, started like most days at Wells Fargo Securities Services. Lori arrived at work on time, settled into her desk, and began her usual routine. But that afternoon, something changed. Lori received a phone call that left her visibly upset. Co-workers watched as she started crying at her desk. She left the office early, something she rarely did. What was that phone call about? Investigators believe Lori had started asking questions about Mark's enrollment status at the University of Utah and his acceptance to UNC Chapel Hill. The timeline suggests she'd made calls to both schools, and the answers she received didn't match what Mark had been telling her. That same Friday evening, Lori attended her going-away party at Wells Fargo. Her co-workers had planned a celebration to send her off before the big move to North Carolina. There's a photo from that party showing Lori standing behind a cake, smiling for the camera. Her colleagues had no idea that within days they'd be searching for her body. What happened over the weekend remains partially unclear, but by Sunday night, July 18, 2004, Lori and Mark were having the conversation that would seal her fate. According to Mark's later confession and court documents, Lori confronted him about his lies. She'd discovered he'd never graduated from the University of Utah. She'd learned he'd never applied to medical school. The entire future they'd been planning together was based on deception. Lori wrote Mark a note that night. In it, she said she planned to leave him. The exact contents of that note were never fully made public, but it was clear. Lori had reached a breaking point. She couldn't stay with someone who'd built their entire relationship on lies. According to Mark's father, Douglas Hacking, who later spoke to the media, Lori and Mark argued that evening. After the argument, Lori went to bed. Mark stayed up, playing Nintendo. An hour later, Mark walked into their bedroom with a .22 caliber rifle. He shot Lori in the head while she slept. Mark's father later told reporters that Mark just snapped when Lori learned about his years of deception. But the evidence suggests this wasn't a moment of sudden rage. Mark had time to think. He had an hour while Lori slept. He had time to make a different choice. Instead, he chose murder. After killing Lori, Mark rolled her body in carpet. He loaded it into his car and drove to a dumpster where he disposed of her like trash. Then he went home, cleaned up the evidence as best he could, and prepared to play the role of a devastated husband. The next morning, July 19, 2004, Mark Hacking called 911 at 10:49 a.m. He told the dispatcher his wife had gone jogging at Memory Grove Park around 6 a.m. and never came home. He said he'd been looking for her for hours, that he was worried, that something terrible must have happened. The city of Salt Lake City mobilized immediately. Volunteers poured into Memory Grove Park. Search teams combed through trails, canyons, and dense brush. Local news stations ran Lori's photo on every channel. Mark stood in front of cameras crying, pleading for anyone who'd seen his wife to come forward. The community wrapped their arms around him, offering support, sympathy, and hope. But the entire time, Mark knew exactly where Lori was, and she wasn't in Memory Grove Park. Detective Eslinger of the Salt Lake City Police Department caught the case on July 19th. He's a seasoned investigator, the kind who knows that when someone goes missing, the first 48 hours are critical. But within the first day, something about Mark Hacking's story started to feel wrong. Joggers don't vanish from busy parks at 6 a.m. Memory Grove Park is popular with early morning runners, dog walkers, and people heading to work. If Lori had been jogging there that morning, someone would have seen her. But as Detective Eslinger interviewed witnesses and reviewed security footage, he found nothing. No one had seen Lori at Memory Grove Park that morning. Not a single person. Then there was Mark's timeline. He claimed Lori left for her jog around 6 a.m., but he didn't call 911 until 10:49 a.m., nearly 5 hours later. When Detective Eslinger asked why he'd waited so long to report her missing, Mark's answers kept changing. First, he said he'd fallen back asleep. Then he said he'd driven around looking for her. Then he said he'd called her cell phone multiple times, but phone records later showed no such calls had been made. On July 20th, Detective Eslinger obtained a warrant to search the Hacking apartment. What his team found turned a missing person case into a homicide investigation. There was blood on the headboard of the bed. Not a lot, but enough to raise immediate red flags. A knife in the kitchen tested positive for blood residue, and the bedroom mattress was missing entirely. When investigators checked with the city's waste management service, they discovered that Mark had called for a bulk trash pickup on the morning of July 19th, requesting removal of a mattress and box spring. The items had been collected around 8 a.m., hours before Mark called 911 to report Lori missing. Think about that for a moment. Mark claimed he spent the morning frantically searching for his missing wife, but during that time, he'd arranged for a waste management company to haul away his mattress. Detective Eslinger also found the note Lori had written to Mark, the one where she said she planned to leave him after discovering his lies. The note was hidden in a drawer, crumpled like someone had tried to throw it away, and then thought better of it. As investigators dug deeper into Mark's background, they uncovered the elaborate web of lies he'd been maintaining for years. Mark had told everyone he was finishing his undergraduate degree at the University of Utah. Records showed he'd stopped attending classes years earlier and was still several credits short of graduation. He'd told everyone he'd been accepted to medical school at UNC Chapel Hill. The admissions office confirmed he'd never even applied. For over a year, Mark had been leaving their apartment every morning with a backpack, pretending to go to class. Where was he going? Investigators traced his movements through credit card receipts and witness statements. Most days, Mark spent hours at coffee shops, libraries, and parks. He was maintaining an elaborate performance, leaving the house at the right time, coming home at the right time, keeping up the appearance of a student working toward graduation. But he wasn't working toward anything. He was just running out the clock, hoping nobody would check his story. By July 23rd, 4 days after Lori's disappearance, Mark checked himself into the University Neuropsychiatric Institute, a psychiatric hospital. His family told the media he was struggling with the trauma of losing his wife, that the stress had become unbearable. But what happened inside that hospital would change everything, Mark confessed. Not to police, not to a lawyer, to his brothers, Lance and Scott Hacking. According to multiple reports confirmed by court documents, Mark told his brothers he had killed Lori. He admitted to shooting her in the head while she slept. He told them he'd rolled her body in carpet and disposed of it in a dumpster. His father, Douglas Hacking, later told reporters that Mark confessed to his 2 older brothers that he killed his wife as she slept and then put the body in a trash bin. Lance and Scott faced an impossible choice. Their brother had just confessed to murder, but he was still their brother. They consulted with their father and the family attorney. On July 24, 2004, they contacted the Salt Lake City Police Department and informed Detective Eslinger of Mark's confession. But even with a confession, prosecutors had a problem. Without Lori's body, without physical remains, the case against Mark would be harder to prove. They needed to find her, and they needed to find her fast. On August 2, 2004, Mark Hacking was arrested and booked into the Salt Lake County Jail. 1 week later, on August 9th, formal first-degree murder charges were filed. By then, the massive volunteer search effort had all but stopped. When the news broke that Mark had lied about everything, when the community realized they'd been searching for a woman whose husband had already killed her, the volunteers disappeared. What started with over 200 people on the first Tuesday dropped to just a handful within 48 hours. The focus shifted to the Salt Lake Valley landfill. Based on Mark's confession and waste management records, investigators knew that the dumpster where Mark had disposed of Lori's body had been emptied on July 19th and taken to the landfill. But finding a body in a landfill is like searching for a needle in a haystack. The Salt Lake Valley landfill covers hundreds of acres. Garbage is compacted and buried under layers of waste, sometimes 30 feet deep. The search began in early August 2004 and would become one of the most extensive forensic searches in Utah history. Investigators brought in cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists, and teams of volunteers willing to spend weeks in brutal summer heat, sifting through tons of decomposing garbage. Then, on the morning of October 1, 2004, at approximately 8:20 a.m., searchers found something. It was carpet, the same carpet Mark had admitted to rolling Lori's body into. And inside that carpet were human remains. By that afternoon, using dental records, investigators confirmed what everyone already feared. They'd found Lori Hacking. The lies didn't start in 2004. They'd been building for years, a careful architecture of deception that Mark had constructed piece by piece. And once investigators started pulling at the threads, they realized just how deep the fabrication went. Mark had been lying to Lori from nearly the beginning of their relationship. When they married in August 1999, Mark was already telling people he was working toward a medical degree. But he'd never been enrolled in medical school. He'd never even completed his undergraduate degree. For over 5 years, Mark maintained this lie. He'd leave the apartment every morning with a backpack, dressed like a student, and tell Lori he was going to class. She had no reason not to believe him. Why would she? They were married. They were building a life together. You don't question your spouse about whether they're actually going to class. But Mark wasn't going to class. He was going to coffee shops, libraries, parks, anywhere he could kill time until it was reasonable to come home. He'd return in the evening and talk about exams, group projects, difficult professors. He'd complain about coursework and celebrate good grades on tests he'd never taken. The performance was constant, detailed, and utterly convincing. Even Mark's job became part of the lie. He worked as a psychiatric hospital orderly, a respectable position, but not the career trajectory his family expected. So Mark embellished. He told people he was working in patient care, gaining experience before medical school. He made his role sound more significant than it was. And in a bizarre twist, he even insisted that patients call him Franz instead of Mark, creating yet another false identity in a life already built on them. The question that haunted investigators was, why? Why construct such an elaborate fiction? Mark came from a good family. His father was a successful physician, but by all accounts, Douglas Hacking had never pressured Mark to follow in his footsteps. Friends described Mark as someone who struggled with direction, who seemed uncertain about what he wanted from life, but was unwilling to admit that uncertainty to anyone. The lie about UNC Chapel Hill was perhaps the most elaborate. Mark didn't just tell people he'd been accepted to medical school. He showed them emails. He talked about the courses he'd be taking. He described the campus. He discussed financial aid packages and student housing options. Lori's family later told police that Mark had talked about North Carolina in such specific detail that nobody thought to question whether it was real. The couple had already started packing. They'd attended going-away parties. Lori had quit her job at Wells Fargo. They'd told both families they were moving in early August. The entire production was designed to keep the lie alive just a little bit longer. But what was Mark's endgame? Did he think he could keep lying forever? Did he have a plan for what would happen when they were supposed to leave for North Carolina and there was no medical school to attend? Investigators believe Mark was in a state of what psychologists call motivated delusion. He'd told the lie for so long that he'd started to believe parts of it himself. He'd created an identity, the successful medical student, the soon-to-be doctor, because it was easier than admitting he didn't know what he wanted or who he was supposed to be. But on July 16, 2004, when Lori made those phone calls, when she discovered the truth, the entire house of cards collapsed in a single afternoon, and Mark, faced with losing everything, made the decision to eliminate the one person who could expose him. There's another disturbing detail that emerged later. After Mark's conviction, it was discovered that he'd been selling murder memorabilia from prison. Autographs, inmate forms, items connected to the case. He was profiting from Lori's death. It showed a level of narcissism that even investigators found shocking. Mark wasn't just a liar. He was someone who saw his wife's murder as an opportunity. After Mark confessed to his brothers on July 24, 2004, his family faced an impossible situation. They loved Mark. He was their son, their brother. But he just admitted to murdering his wife, a woman they'd also loved for 10 years. Douglas Hacking, Mark's father, later spoke to the media about that moment. He said Mark had just snapped when Lori learned about his years of deception. But that word, snapped, suggests a moment of sudden rage, an uncontrollable impulse. The evidence tells a different story. Mark had time. He argued with Lori. She went to bed. He played Nintendo for an hour. Then he got a rifle, walked into their bedroom and shot her while she slept. That's not snapping, that's a choice. On August 2, 2004, Mark was arrested. By then, The community that had rallied around him felt betrayed. Volunteers who'd spent days searching Memory Grove Park, who'd taken time off work and brought their families to help find Lori, realized they'd been manipulated. They'd given their time and energy to help a man who'd been lying to them from the start. The search for Lori's body continued through August and September. It was grueling work. Forensic teams and volunteers spent weeks at the Salt Lake Valley landfill, working in oppressive heat, sifting through garbage, following leads from cadaver dogs. The psychological toll was immense. They were looking for a young pregnant woman who'd been murdered by her husband and thrown away like trash. Thelma Soares, Lori's mother, had been waiting for that call for over 2 months. When it came, it brought a strange mix of relief and devastation. Relief that Lori had been found, that there would be closure. Devastation that the worst fear had been confirmed. On October 29, 2004, Mark appeared in court for his arraignment. To everyone's surprise, he pleaded not guilty. His defense attorney, D. Gilbert Athay, indicated they might pursue an insanity defense. But Lori's family wasn't interested in a lengthy trial. They wanted justice, and they wanted Mark to take responsibility for what he'd done. Lori's brother, Paul Soares, made a public plea. He asked Mark to save your family the grief and cost and plead guilty to murder. He said that dragging the family through a trial, forcing them to relive Lori's death in graphic detail, would only add to the pain Mark had already caused. For months, nothing happened. Mark sat in jail. His defense team prepared for trial. But behind the scenes, negotiations were taking place. Prosecutors offered Mark a deal: plead guilty to first-degree murder, and they wouldn't seek the death penalty. In exchange, Mark would be sentenced to 6 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving the minimum term. On April 15, 2005, Mark changed his plea. He stood before Judge Denise Lindbergh in Utah's 3rd District Court and admitted in open court that he had murdered his wife. According to reports, Mark spoke in halted, broken sentences. He called Lori his heart and soul. He said he still loved her but couldn't explain why he'd killed her. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for June 6, 2005. Lori's family attended, sitting in the front row, ready to face the man who'd taken their daughter, their sister, their friend. Thelma Soares gave a victim impact statement. Her words, captured by multiple news outlets, were powerful and heartbreaking. She told the court, "I have a hard time coping intellectually and emotionally, trying to reconcile the two Marks. I've known that kid for 10 years and loved him." She described how Mark had treated Lori like a precious thing in his life, which made his betrayal all the more incomprehensible. Thelma also revealed that she wore Lori's wedding ring, a small way to keep her daughter close. She talked about the future Lori would never have, the child she'd never raise, the life she'd never build. She said Mark had stolen all of that, and for what? Because he was too afraid to tell the truth. Judge Denise Lindbergh listened to the victim impact statements, reviewed the evidence, and then addressed Mark directly. She told him he was the poster child for dishonesty. She said his lies had been so extensive, so calculated, that they revealed a fundamental inability to live in reality. And when reality finally caught up to him, he'd chosen murder over accountability. Mark was sentenced to 6 years to life in prison. Under Utah law, this meant he'd serve a minimum of 6 years before becoming eligible for parole. But eligibility for parole doesn't guarantee release. The Utah Board of Pardons and Parole would review his case and determine whether he'd served enough time and whether he posed a risk to public safety. After sentencing, the parole board set Mark's hearing date. It wasn't in 6 years, it wasn't in 10 years. It was set for 2035, 30 years after his conviction. The board cited aggravating factors. Mark had obstructed justice by disposing of Lori's body and falsely claiming she was missing. He'd manipulated an entire community into searching for a woman he'd already killed. And he'd shown little genuine remorse or understanding of why he'd committed such a horrific act. Mike Sibbett, chairman of the Utah Board of Pardons, made it clear that even when 2035 arrived, the hearing would not guarantee Mark's release. The board would evaluate his behavior in prison, his participation in rehabilitation programs, and whether he posed a threat if returned to society. By the summer of 2005, Mark Hacking was in prison, facing the reality that he might spend the rest of his life there. Lori's family was trying to rebuild, to find some way to move forward after losing her. And the city of Salt Lake City was left grappling with a question that still haunts people today. How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the monster they turned out to be? But there's more to this story, because what happened after Mark's conviction reveals something even darker about who he really was. If this case is as compelling to you as it is to me, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. I spend weeks researching cases like this, pulling court documents, verifying every detail, making sure we honor the victims by getting the facts right. Subscribing helps me keep doing this work, and it means you'll never miss an episode. Let's keep going. After Mark was sentenced, most people assumed the case was over. He was in prison. Lori's family had closure. The community could move on. But in the years that followed, more details emerged that painted an even darker picture of who Mark Hacking really was. In 2015, 10 years after Mark's conviction, a disturbing story broke. Reporters discovered that Mark had been selling murder memorabilia from prison. Autographs, signed inmate documents, items connected to Lori's case. He was profiting from her death. Collectors who buy items from infamous criminals had been purchasing Mark's signatures and personal effects, and Mark had been actively participating in that market. When Thelma Soares learned about this, she was devastated all over again. In an interview, she said that Mark's willingness to profit from Lori's murder showed he still didn't understand the gravity of what he'd done. It wasn't just that he'd killed Lori, it was that even years later he saw her death as something he could exploit. But there was also something unexpected that happened in those years. Thelma Soares, the woman who'd lost her daughter to Mark's violence, decided to forgive him. In a 2015 interview on the 10-year anniversary of Mark's conviction, Thelma said she'd reached a point where holding on to anger was destroying her. She said she forgave Mark, not because he deserved it, but because she needed to let go of the hatred to move forward with her own life. She was clear, though, that forgiveness didn't mean she'd forgotten. She said she would never get over losing Lori, that the pain would never fully heal, but she couldn't spend the rest of her life consumed by rage at Mark, so she chose to forgive, even if Mark himself had never truly asked for forgiveness. Thelma's decision sparked conversations about what forgiveness means in cases like this. Some people admired her strength, her ability to let go of hatred even after such a profound loss. Others felt that Mark didn't deserve forgiveness, that he'd forfeited any right to grace when he killed Lori. There's no easy answer. Forgiveness is personal. It's not something anyone can dictate or judge. Thelma made the choice that allowed her to survive, and that's all any of us can do in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Inside prison, Mark's behavior painted a picture of someone still struggling with his identity. According to reports from the Utah Department of Corrections, Mark participated in some rehabilitation programs, but kept largely to himself. He wasn't a model prisoner, but he also wasn't a troublemaker. He existed in a kind of limbo, serving time, waiting for a parole hearing that was still decades away. In interviews with prison staff and fellow inmates, Mark was described as someone who still couldn't fully accept responsibility for what he'd done. He'd admit to killing Lori in a factual sense. He'd pleaded guilty after all, but he struggled to articulate why he'd done it, or to show genuine understanding of the pain he'd caused. This isn't uncommon in cases involving narcissistic personality traits. People like Mark can admit to actions, but struggle to connect those actions to their emotional impact on others. They see themselves as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of their own destruction. One detail that emerged from prison records was particularly chilling. Mark had written letters to family members over the years, and in some of those letters, he talked about Lori as if she was still alive. He'd refer to their relationship in the present tense, talk about things they used to do as if they might do them again. It suggested a profound disconnect from reality, an inability to fully accept that he'd ended her life. Psychologists who reviewed the case noted that Mark's behavior fit a pattern seen in people who build elaborate false identities. When the false identity collapses, they don't return to reality. They simply construct a new false narrative to replace the old one. In prison, Mark seemed to be doing exactly that, creating a version of events where he was still somehow the victim, where circumstances had conspired against him rather than his own choices leading to tragedy. But there's one more piece of this story that's important to understand. Mark's lies didn't just destroy Lori's life, they destroyed his own family as well. Douglas Hacking, Mark's father, retreated from public life after the conviction. The family that had once been prominent in Salt Lake City largely disappeared from view. They'd been betrayed just like everyone else, left to grapple with the knowledge that someone they loved had committed an unforgivable act. Mark's brothers, Lance and Scott, the ones who'd turned him in, carried their own burden. They'd done the right thing by going to police, but it meant they'd sent their own brother to prison. That kind of moral weight doesn't disappear, even when you know you made the only choice you could. In the end, Mark's lies didn't just take Lori's life. They destroyed multiple families, fractured a community's trust, and left scars that will never fully heal. Lori Kay Soares Hacking was 27 years old when she died. She was 5 weeks pregnant. She'd been planning to become a mother, to move across the country, to start a new chapter of her life. All of that was stolen from her on the night of July 18, 2004, by the person who was supposed to love and protect her. Her family struggled to find ways to honor her memory beyond the headlines and the crime scene photos. But they also had to figure out how to live in the aftermath of such profound loss. How do you celebrate holidays when someone's missing from the table? How do you mark birthdays when the person you're celebrating is gone? How do you move forward when the future you'd imagined has been violently ripped away? Thelma later said that one of the hardest parts was reconciling the two versions of Mark she'd known. For 10 years, she'd thought of him as a son-in-law, someone who loved Lori, someone who was part of the family. Then, in a matter of days, he became the man who murdered her daughter. Those two images didn't fit together, and trying to make sense of them was almost impossible. In the years after Mark's conviction, there were occasional efforts to create something positive from the tragedy. Some people suggested establishing a memorial fund in Lori's name, though it's unclear if such a fund was ever formally created. What is clear is that people wanted Lori to be remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. Lori was someone who cared about people. She remembered birthdays. She made her co-workers feel valued. She was excited about becoming a mother. Those are the things that defined her life, not the violence that ended it. There are details from this case that remain sealed in court files, information that has never been made fully public. Some evidence introduced during plea negotiations, some statements Mark made to investigators. These remain protected, either for legal reasons or out of respect for Lori's family. The murder weapon, the .22 caliber rifle Mark used to kill Lori, was never recovered. Investigators believe it's buried somewhere in the Salt Lake Valley landfill, but after all these years, the likelihood of finding it is essentially zero. The landfill has continued operating, with new layers of waste added every day. Whatever evidence remains there is now buried under decades of garbage. Lori's headstone originally bore the name Hacking, but her family later had it changed. They replaced Hacking with the Portuguese word filhinha, which means little daughter. It was a way to reclaim Lori's identity, to remember her as their daughter rather than as Mark Hacking's victim. The case of Lori and Mark Hacking shows us something uncomfortable about human nature. It shows how easily someone can construct a false identity, how long they can maintain it, and how catastrophically it can collapse when the truth finally emerges. Mark's lies weren't just about medical school or college credits. They were about control, about avoiding the discomfort of being seen as he truly was. He'd rather kill his pregnant wife than admit he'd been lying for years. That calculation, his ego valued higher than her life, is what makes this case so disturbing. Lori died because she discovered the truth. She made 2 phone calls on July 16, 2004, and those calls unraveled Mark's carefully constructed fiction. Within 3 days, she was dead. She didn't have time to leave. She didn't have time to protect herself. She trusted the person she'd married, and that trust cost her everything. If there's anything to take from this case, it's this: deception compounds. Small lies become bigger ones. Big ones become catastrophic. And in some cases, when the liar is confronted with exposure, they choose violence over accountability. Mark Hacking will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Even if he's granted parole in 2035, he'll be in his 60s, and he'll carry the weight of what he did for whatever years he has left. But Lori doesn't get those years. She doesn't get to raise her child, to grow old, to see what her life could have become. That's the real tragedy here, not what Mark lost, but what Lori never got to have. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what moment in this case affected you most. Was it the discovery of Lori's body in the landfill? The fact that Mark played Nintendo for an hour before killing her? The going away party photo taken just days before her death? Your perspective matters, and these conversations help us process cases that are this heavy. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Cases like this take weeks of research, pulling court documents, verifying every detail, making sure we honor the victim by getting the facts right. If you found value in this breakdown, subscribe to the channel. We cover cases like this regularly, always with the same commitment to accuracy and respect for the people whose lives were affected. Lori Kay Soares Hacking deserved better. She deserved honesty, she deserved safety, she deserved a future. We remember her not as a victim in a true crime story, but as a 27-year-old woman who loved her work, cared about her friends and family, and was excited about becoming a mother. That's who she was. That's who we've lost. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.